2 nights later, Julian received a call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Julian. Gerald's voice was sharp, stripped of its usual polish. You've made a mistake you don't understand. Julian's grip tightened on the phone. No, Gerald, I understand perfectly. You think the law will save you? Gerald spat. The law bends. It bends for people like me. But it breaks people like you. Julian swallowed hard. Then I guess we'll see if it breaks. There was silence on the other end, heavy and cold. Then Gerald's voice, low and venomous. Watch your back. The line went dead. The very next day, the retaliation began. Julian's photography business, his sanctuary, his livelihood was hit with a barrage of one-star reviews, fake client complaints, even false claims of harassment filed anonymously to the Better Business Bureau. His website crashed under a flood of spam traffic. Haley's work email filled with messages accusing her of being complicit, of betraying the Whitmore family, of being the spoiled daughter who turned on her blood. Everywhere they turned, shadows pressed closer. Julian wanted to believe it was desperation, that these were the flailing strikes of a man losing his empire. But the weight of it was suffocating. At night, he lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, every sound magnified by dread. The black sedan no longer followed him. And somehow, that made it worse. It meant Gerald had shifted tactics. Then came the leak. On Monday morning, Asheville's largest newspaper ran a story with Julian's face on the front page. Photographer who brought down Whitmore's accused of affair, fraudulent billing. The article was filled with lies. Fabricated text messages, photos crudely edited to suggest infidelity, a former client, claiming Julian had overcharged and falsified invoices. Haley read it silently at the kitchen table, her hand trembling as she turned the page. Do you believe this? Julian whispered. Haley looked up at him, her eyes filled not with doubt, but fire. No, and they know I don't. But they want the world to believe it. Julian sat heavily, his heart hammering. This wasn't about convincing Haley. This was about destroying his credibility, tainting him so thoroughly that when he testified against Gerald, the court would see a liar, a cheat, a man who couldn't be trusted. It was Gerald's most dangerous weapon yet. Vanessa arrived that evening, her face pale, her hands clutching her phone. They're eating each other alive, she said breathlessly. I just left a board meeting. Gerald's partners are abandoning him. He shouted at Owen in front of everyone, called him a traitor. Diane's in damage control, but she's unraveling. I think she's... Vanessa hesitated, lowering her voice. I think she's drinking again. Heavily. Julian's stomach knotted. He had never pitied Diane, not after what she'd done, but the image of her unraveling in private shook him. They won't stop, Julian, Vanessa whispered. Not until you're ruined or they are. Julian nodded grimly. Then I guess we're almost at the end. But the end came closer than he expected. 3 nights later, Julian left the studio late. The streets were empty, the cool mountain air crisp. He walked to his car, keys in hand, then froze. The driver's side window was shattered. Glass glittered like ice on the pavement. Inside, the seats were slashed. His camera bag was gone. His laptop too, but it wasn't a robbery. No, because taped to the steering wheel was a single photograph. It was of Haley, taken from across the street. Julian's blood ran cold. His hands shook as he peeled it from the wheel. Written across the bottom, in thick black ink, next. Julian drove home like a madman, heart pounding, headlights cutting through the darkness. Haley was safe, thank God, curled on the couch with Eliza in her arms. But when he showed her the photo, she went pale. They won't stop, she whispered. Julian took her hands, forcing his voice steady. Then we won't stop either. We'll finish this. Completely. No more half measures. Haley looked at him with something between fear and resolve. Finish it how? Julian glanced toward the envelope of records still on his desk. His voice was low, determined. By making sure they can never rise again. Outside, unseen, a car idled at the end of the street. Its engine hummed softly in the night before it slipped away, swallowed by the darkness. The war wasn't over. It was only beginning. He sat in the dark, the photo of Haley clutched in his hand, its edges crumpled from his grip. He couldn't stop staring at the grain of the image, the way the lens had captured Haley in profile, soft light on her hair, her lips parted slightly as she'd spoken to Eliza through the window. It wasn't just a photo. It was a threat, a promise. They'd taken his career, they'd tried to take his credibility. And now, they were aiming at the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. He rose from his chair slowly, the cold resolve in his chest heavier than exhaustion. He'd fought with evidence, with words, with restraint. But Gerald and Diane weren't playing by rules. Maybe it was time he stopped pretending he could. The next morning, Julian drove into town, not to his studio, but to a coffee shop where Jason, his old toxicology client turned reluctant ally, sometimes worked remotely. Jason looked up in surprise as Julian approached his table. "You look like hell," Jason said. Julian sat. "I need your help again." Jason frowned. "This about the Whitmores?" Julian slid the photograph across the table. Jason stiffened. "Jesus Christ. They broke into my car. They took my equipment, and then they left this." Jason's mouth tightened. "You need the police." Julian shook his head. "Police can't touch Gerald, not yet. Not when he's still got influence in this town." He leaned in. "I need a plan. Something airtight. Something that doesn't just expose him, it destroys him." Jason studied him carefully. "You're talking about war, Julian." Julian's voice was cold. "It's already war." That night, he sat with Haley at the kitchen table after Eliza was asleep. "They're escalating," Julian told her. "If we wait, they'll come closer. They'll keep pushing until something breaks." Haley's hands trembled around her tea. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we stop reacting. We stop letting them write the script. We take control." Her eyes met his, full of fear and exhaustion. "You sound like them." Julian froze. But Haley reached across the table, her grip firm. "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying, if you go down this road, you have to be smarter than them. No rage, no recklessness, just precision." Julian nodded slowly. She was right. He couldn't let his anger drive him. If he wanted to protect them, he had to turn his photographer's eye to the war itself. Focus on the details, frame the narrative, capture the truth so vividly it couldn't be denied. Not vengeance, justice, sharpened like a blade. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Vanessa called 2 days later, her voice urgent. "You need to hear this. Gerald has a meeting tomorrow, off the record, late night, at his office. He thinks it's private, but it isn't. He's meeting with Cole, the lawyer who helped hide the accounts." Julian's pulse quickened. "If I could record it, you'd have him," Vanessa finished. Finally, Julian exhaled. "Then that's what I'll do." The night of the meeting, Julian parked 2 blocks away from Whitmore Tower, his heart pounding as he checked his gear. A small wireless mic, a backup recorder, his camera with a telephoto lens. Jason's words echoed in his head. "This is war." He moved through shadows, slipping into the service alley behind the building. He'd scouted the location earlier. The glass conference room on the 12th floor had a direct line of sight from a rooftop across the street. He'd already mapped his angles. Within minutes, he was crouched on that rooftop, camera trained through the window. And there they were, Gerald, Adrian Cole, 2 other men he didn't recognize. Papers spread across the table, voices muffled by distance but clear enough through the directional mic. Julian adjusted the focus, snapping still after still. His lens captured everything. Gerald pointing at numbers, Cole gesturing angrily, the unmistakable shapes of wire transfer documents. Then, words that froze Julian in place. "We can move the assets to Zurich," Gerald was saying. "But if Mercer pushes further, if he doesn't back down, then we take care of him," Cole interrupted flatly. Julian's pulse thundered. His finger trembled on the shutter. He zoomed in, catching Gerald's expression, not horror, not objection. Agreement. The frame was perfect, evidence, undeniable. But as Julian lowered the camera, his breath caught. Across the street, in the reflection of the glass, another figure moved. A silhouette, on the rooftop opposite his own. Watching him, Julian scrambled back, heart slamming. Had Gerald known he'd come? Was the bait laid for him instead? He ducked low, crawling across the roof until he reached the fire escape, descending into the shadows of the alley. He didn't look back until he was blocks away. But when he did, the rooftop was empty. The silhouette was gone. Back home, Julian transferred the files, hands shaking as he watched the footage. Every word was there, crisp and damning. Enough to ruin Gerald forever. Haley stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the nail in the coffin." Julian stared at the frozen frame on the screen. Gerald's smug face caught mid-sentence. "No," Julian murmured. "It's just the beginning." For the first time, Julian wasn't afraid. He was ready. At dawn, he sent the files. The recordings, the photographs, the transcripts. He compiled them into a single encrypted package and forwarded it to 3 people: Vanessa, Jason, and the Asheville Chronicle's lead investigative journalist. By mid-morning, the calls began. First Vanessa, breathless. "Julian, this is nuclear. He can't come back from this. You've got him." Then Jason, terse. "Be careful, you just cornered a wolf." Finally, the reporter, her tone calm but urgent. "Mr. Mercer, if this checks out, and it will, this isn't just local. This is federal. We're talking racketeering, fraud, conspiracy. You've blown the doors off." Julian listened, numb. He'd wanted this moment, imagined it, clung to it. But now that it was real, it felt less like victory and more like stepping into an earthquake. By noon, the story had broken. Whitmore caught on tape. Plans to hide assets, discusses eliminating whistleblower. The footage ran on every major outlet, Gerald's voice echoing from televisions in coffee shops, gas stations, and office lobbies. Haley watched it unfold on their couch, hands trembling as she clutched Eliza. "They can't deny this," she whispered. "They can't spin this." Julian sat beside her, jaw tight. "They'll try." They did more than try. That evening, Diane appeared on national television, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "My husband has been betrayed by a vindictive man," she said, her eyes shimmering with crocodile tears. "Julian Mercer has doctored evidence, manipulated facts, and weaponized lies to destroy our family. This is not just an attack on Gerald, it's an attack on truth itself." Julian muted the television, bile rising in his throat. Haley shook her head, furious. "She's still covering for him. After everything. Still lying." Julian pressed his palms against his temples. "It doesn't matter. The evidence speaks louder than her performance." But a small, gnawing voice inside whispered otherwise. He'd seen people believe worse lies than Diane's. And he knew the Whitmores wouldn't stop at speeches. That night, he found the message. Slipped beneath their front door in an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You've made your move, now it's ours." Beneath the words was a photograph. Not of Haley this time. Of Eliza, asleep in her crib. Julian's blood went ice cold. His hands shook as he showed Haley. She let out a strangled gasp, clutching her mouth. "They were in our house," Julian whispered. "While we were here." Haley collapsed into the chair, her face white as chalk. "We can't stay. Not here. Not another night." Julian nodded, his chest tight. He grabbed his phone, calling Jason. "Bring the baby," Jason said firmly. "Stay with me. It's safer than your house. We'll figure this out." Julian hung up, grabbed their bags, and started packing with frantic precision. Because now it wasn't just about exposing Gerald. It was survival. They stayed at Jason's cabin that night, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Isolated, hidden, Jason stood guard like a soldier, shotgun by the door, his eyes scanning every shadow outside. Julian lay awake, listening to Haley's soft breaths beside him, Eliza between them. His heart ached as he looked at them. They were all he had. And Gerald had just proven he'd do anything to take them away. Julian closed his eyes, resolve hardening like stone. No more playing defense. No more waiting for the next move. It was time to end this, for good. The following morning, Vanessa arrived at the cabin, her face pale but determined. "They're collapsing," she said. "Gerald's partners are abandoning him. The feds are circling, but he's dangerous, Julian. He's wounded. And wounded animals bite hardest." Julian nodded grimly. "Then we take away his teeth." Vanessa frowned. "What are you saying?" Julian looked between her, Jason, and Haley. His voice was steady, cold. "I'm saying we stop letting him choose the battlefield. If Gerald wants to play predator, fine. But predators bleed, too. And I'm going to make him bleed. Outside, the mountains were quiet, mist curling over the trees. But Julian knew the quiet wouldn't last. The reckoning was here, and it would be bloody. The air in Jason's cabin was thick with tension, the kind that hummed just beneath the skin like an electric current. Julian barely touched his breakfast, his eyes locked on the laptop screen where headlines screamed across every news outlet. Whitmore empire crumbling amid federal probe. Secret recordings raise questions of conspiracy, fraud. Family patriarch in hiding as investigations widen. Julian scrolled, scanning every update, every mention of Gerald's name. Yet none of it brought relief. If anything, the more Gerald's empire unraveled, the more dangerous he became. Jason leaned against the kitchen counter, coffee mug in hand, watching Julian like a doctor studying a patient on the verge of collapse. You can't keep staring at that screen, Mercer. He's not going to vanish because you refresh the page. Julian tore his gaze away, rubbing at the shadows beneath his eyes. No, he won't vanish. But if I miss a move, if I don't see what's coming. He trailed off, fists tightening. I can't afford that, not when they've already been inside my house. Haley sat across from him, cradling Eliza in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. Julian, look at me. He did. You've done more than anyone thought possible. You've exposed him, torn down everything he built on lies. But if you let him drag you into the mud with him, if you let him consume every thought, he still wins. Julian swallowed, his chest aching. Haley's strength was the only thing keeping him tethered. But then he remembered the photograph of Eliza sleeping in her crib. A photograph someone had taken while standing just feet away from her, in their home. No, Gerald hadn't just declared war. He'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Julian stood, his voice low and calm. It ends now. Julian's plan wasn't reckless. It was precise, calculated, sharpened like the edge of a blade. He knew Gerald, knew his patterns, his pride, his desperate need to control the narrative. So Julian would give him a stage. And then he'd burn it down around him. With Jason's help, Julian arranged a private meeting, one Gerald couldn't resist. It would be pitched as a negotiation, a chance to settle things, without dragging the family name further into ruin. The bait was irresistible. Gerald agreed within hours, sending word through one of his remaining attorneys. The meeting would take place in Gerald's private country estate outside Charlotte. Neutral ground, the attorney said. Julian almost laughed at that. There was nothing neutral about Gerald's world. Every inch of it was designed for dominance. But Julian wasn't coming unprepared. He packed more than his camera equipment this time. The estate was sprawling, a mansion that seemed to rise out of manicured gardens like a monument to excess. Gerald's fortress. Jason drove, Vanessa in the backseat beside Julian. Haley stayed at the cabin with Eliza. Julian had begged her not to come. If this went wrong, he needed to know they were safe. As they pulled into the long driveway, Jason muttered, "Man builds himself a palace, but it's all going to be ashes soon." Gerald was waiting inside, flanked by two men who looked more like hired muscle than associates. Diane sat near the fireplace, composed as ever, though the tightness around her mouth betrayed her unease. "Julian," Gerald said smoothly, rising to greet him. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Takes guts, walking into the lion's den." Julian met his gaze evenly. "I didn't come to be eaten." Gerald chuckled, gesturing for him to sit. "Still sharp. Good, let's get to it." For the first half hour, Gerald spoke in circles. He framed Julian as a manipulator, a leech, a man who had tricked Haley into abandoning her family's legacy. He admitted to missteps but painted them as misunderstandings. Diane chimed in occasionally, her tone syrupy sweet, pleading for Julian to think of Haley, think of Eliza. Julian listened silently, recording every word. His patience was ice cold, his trap nearly sprung. Finally, Gerald leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the same predatory arrogance that had always defined him. "Here's the truth, Julian. You can't win. You might have bruised me, yes, but I've survived worse. What you don't understand is that I am the current. The tide. You can't fight me, you can only drown." Julian smiled faintly. "Funny, tides turn." He slid a small device across the table. Gerald frowned, picking it up. A projector. It hummed to life, casting light against the far wall. Images appeared. Footage, emails, voice recordings. Every damning piece of evidence Julian had compiled, stitched together into a narrative impossible to deny. Gerald's face paled as his own voice filled the room. Maybe he disappears. Maybe he has an accident. People vanish all the time. Diane gasped, turning to her husband. You told me it was handled. You said there was nothing left. Gerald's mask cracked, fury boiling to the surface. You stupid. He cut himself off, slamming a fist against the table. Julian, turn that off. Julian's voice was calm, almost serene. It's already online. Live streaming, actually. Every word you say right now is being heard by a federal investigator, a journalist, and more than a few former allies who've been waiting for you to hang yourself. Gerald froze. Jason and Vanessa shifted slightly, their presence a silent wall behind Julian. Diane's composure shattered. You've destroyed us, she hissed. Do you understand? Everything we built. Julian's eyes were like steel. You destroyed yourselves. I just made sure the world saw it. Gerald surged to his feet, veins bulging at his temples. For a moment, Julian thought he might strike him. But then the front doors burst open. Federal agents swarmed in, weapons drawn, voices booming. FBI. Nobody move. Chaos erupted. Gerald shouted, Diane screamed. The bodyguards reached instinctively for concealed weapons, only to be tackled to the ground within seconds. Julian remained seated, calm in the storm. He'd arranged this too. The livestream had been the lure, the FBI the net. As Gerald was handcuffed, his face twisted in rage. You think you've won, Mercer? You're nothing without me. Nothing. Julian stood, meeting his glare one last time. No, I'm everything you'll never be. A husband, a father, a man who doesn't need to control the world to know his worth. Gerald spat at the floor, struggling as the agents dragged him away. Diane collapsed into a chair, sobbing, not from guilt, but from the ruin of her empire. Julian walked past her without a word. Outside, the night air was cool, crisp, free. On the drive back to the cabin, Vanessa exhaled shakily. That was, Jesus, Julian, you just buried him alive. Jason chuckled dryly. Buried? More like nailed the coffin shut and lit the match. Julian stared out the window, the weight of it all settling in. He had expected triumph, but what he felt was exhaustion. Relief, yes, but also the heavy ache of knowing battles like this never truly ended. But when they arrived at the cabin and he saw Haley waiting on the porch, Eliza in her arms, her eyes shining with fierce pride and love, Julian knew he had won in the only way that mattered. He crossed the porch, pulling them both into his arms. Haley whispered against his chest, "It's over?" Julian kissed her hair, his voice steady. "It's over." By the time Gerald Whitmore's trial began, summer had broken across North Carolina in a blaze of relentless heat. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps every morning, microphones thrust into the faces of anyone who so much as brushed against the Whitmore name. Gerald arrived each day in a tailored suit that no longer fit his shrinking frame, his wrists still raw from the cuffs that had become his new jewelry. His once carefully groomed hair had gone gray at the temples, his skin drawn tight over his cheekbones. But his eyes, those predatory eyes, still gleamed with a stubborn fire. The charges were staggering. Conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. And those were just the financial crimes. Federal prosecutors hinted at darker allegations, violent threats, attempted coercion, that painted Gerald not just as a white-collar criminal but as a dangerous man who had ruled his empire through fear. Julian sat through the trial only once. He didn't need to see Gerald again to know how the story would end. But he went, if only to look the man in the eye one last time. Gerald spotted him as soon as he entered the courtroom. That smirk, crooked and defiant, flickered across his lips. It was a silent taunt. You haven't won yet. But when the prosecution began playing the recordings, the live stream, the threats, the carefully documented fraud schemes, the smirk cracked. For the first time, Julian saw not the empire builder, not the predator, but an old man standing knee-deep in quicksand with no way out. Diane testified, her voice brittle with desperation. She claimed ignorance, swore she had no knowledge of Gerald's dealings. But the emails and financial transfers tied her name too neatly into the knots. The jury's eyes told the truth. Her pleas would not save her. The trial lasted 3 months. The verdict took less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Gerald didn't flinch when the judge read the sentence. 32 years in federal prison, no chance of parole before 25. As bailiffs led him away, Gerald turned his head, searching the crowd. His eyes landed on Julian for a brief moment, and the smirk returned, small, venomous, hollow. A dying ember of pride. Julian simply shook his head. Then he walked out of the courthouse, leaving Gerald Whitmore behind forever. If Gerald's downfall was spectacular, Diane's was quieter but no less devastating. The prosecutors spared her prison in exchange for cooperation, but she was left with nothing. Her name was scorched, her fortune dismantled, her influence reduced to whispers in empty rooms. She moved to a modest condo in Atlanta, far from the marble halls she once commanded. Society pages no longer chronicled her dinners and galas. Now, her name appeared only in gossip blogs, a cautionary tale of arrogance and blind loyalty. Once, Julian might have pitied her. But pity required innocence, and Diane had chosen her side long ago. Haley wrestled with the betrayal. Diane had been more than a stepmother. She had been a force, sometimes cruel, sometimes protective. Now, the truth settled like ash in Haley's chest. Diane had known more than she ever admitted. And that knowledge built a wall between them that could never be dismantled. Julian returned to work, not for Gerald, not for the Whitmore name, but for himself. His documentary, The House of Cards, The Whitmore Story, premiered at an independent film festival in Raleigh. It was raw, unflinching, and deeply personal. Audiences sat in stunned silence as Julian's camera captured the unraveling of one of the South's most powerful families. By the time the credits rolled, there were tears, gasps, and a standing ovation. Soon after, streaming platforms competed for rights. Within weeks, Julian's film was being discussed in classrooms, boardrooms, and on national news. He was no longer just a quiet documentarian from Charlotte. He was a voice, a storyteller who had pulled truth out of shadows. Yet the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the accolades. It was in the quiet evenings on the porch, Eliza playing in the yard while Haley rested her head against his shoulder. It was in the mornings when he woke without fear, without wondering if Gerald's men were outside. It was freedom. One autumn afternoon, Julian received a call from a producer in New York. She wanted to meet, to discuss funding for his next project. The Whitmore story is just the beginning, she said. There are hundreds of Geralds out there. People who believe they're untouchable. People the world needs to see exposed. Julian listened, intrigued but cautious. Part of him longed to dive into another story, to shine light where darkness thrived. But another part feared being consumed by it all again, by the chase, the danger, the sleepless nights. That evening, he told Haley about the offer. She smiled softly, brushing a hand against his cheek. You have a gift, Julian. You see things others miss. But promise me this. Whatever you chase, don't let it chase you back. Don't lose yourself again. He kissed her hand, whispering, I won't. Not this time. Months passed, seasons turned. The Whitmore empire became a cautionary tale taught in business schools, dissected in articles, whispered about in boardrooms. Gerald rotted in prison, Diane faded into obscurity, and the family name that once commanded fear became a synonym for corruption. Julian didn't celebrate their destruction. He didn't need to. Their empire had been built on lies, and lies always collapse under their own weight. What he celebrated was smaller, quieter. Eliza's laughter, Haley's resilience, the life they were building together from the ashes of someone else's ruin. One crisp winter morning, Julian stood on his porch, coffee warming his hands. The sky stretched wide and endless above him, free of storm clouds. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just whole. He turned back toward the house where Haley was calling his name, where Eliza's tiny footsteps echoed against the floor. The world was waiting, yes. New stories, new battles. But for now, Julian Mercer had already won. And that was enough.